When they parked, he added, "There's nothing in college for me. Movies and reading are the only things in life I really get pleasure out of. School would kill those things for me. Anything I do to pay my rent is probably going to suck, but as long as I have those things, I just might be able to stay sane. Well, good. Come on, let's go in." He appreciated that she didn't try to persuade him that college could help him get into movie making, or that school was the perfect place for readers. He had heard that spiel so many times and just thought that if people assumed that he hadn't already considered that, then they should consider he was too retarded to take them up on their unsolicited advice. How could a fast-paced scholastic environment help someone who was that slow? Michelle seemed to be content to just let him be, and he liked that. Plus, there was the issue of student loans, which he would most likely not qualify for with his average GPA. He had aced a lot of tests in grade school, but he hadn't bothered to do the busy work in between, which had earned him a C average. He already had enough bills, too. He had been an acquaintance of a guy who was in his late 30s at his first telemarketing job in L.A. The guy turned out to be a complete asshole, but they had worked side by side complacently. The guy had a master's degree in English literature, and Rob had barely made it through high school. Part of the guy's check was garnished every week to pay back his exorbitant loans. Rob got to have that shitty job free of charge, if you don't count that little piece of soul you lose, too. Rob and Michelle walked past the large stone columns on either side of the sliding doors and entered the building. Rob was a little disappointed. From outside it looked sort of grand, but it was only one story and it was lacking that musty book smell that he loved so much. Michelle walked up to the information desk and signed up to use the computer for an hour. They would be closing soon after that. Her turn would come up in a few minutes. She was given terminal number 13 and they had a sinister chuckle at that. When her time came to use the computer, they split up. Rob walked to the far end of the library, which wasn't really that far, and began looking for the section he wanted. Michelle, meanwhile, entered the sterile little room by the entrance of the building to begin her search. It took Rob a little while to find what he was looking for. He was too embarrassed to ask a librarian for help. One thing he could not stand the onslaught of was raised eyebrows. Michelle had a slight hitch in her research as well. When she first sat down at her assigned station, her fingers just hovered over the keyboard. There was no obvious www.com for this. After circling the same rows of books over and over, Rob found what he was looking for. Around the same time, Michelle was making some headway with her keyword searches and exploring a few of the most promising websites that popped up in a list of thousands. Rob was walking his fingers along the spines of the books in the occult section. Michelle's most successful keyword was demonology. There were only about 50 books in the occult section, and Rob had first passed it so many times because instead of the large aisle markers that the other sections had, the occult section had a narrow laminated strip that had been scotch-taped above the books. Plus, the books started 2/3 of the way down one bookshelf. Michelle was scrolling the mouse's arrow along the number of the sites. Under the specific listing she wanted, there were 11,094. Rob found most of the books to be on ESP and other psychic abilities. He may have been undergoing a bout of psychic phenomenon, but this subject was not really what was of interest to him. There were books on witches and vampires supposedly still living throughout the states. Michelle was skimming some headlines. There were demons past and present, facts and fictions in the underworld, and many titles containing the words demonic possession. Demons past and present sounded the most promising, but when she went to that site it was hokey and the drawings and descriptions were cartoonish. There was nothing even remotely resembling what she was looking for. In fact, what was there wasn't even all that informative. The articles were mostly just describing the illustrated pictures. Rob was leafing through folklore and legends. Some of it was interesting, but nothing was leading to anything he wanted so desperately to know. Michelle's hour was rapidly coming to its conclusion. She hadn't even noticed the clock on the wall. What signaled her was the irate tapping of a pencil against a textbook from a teenage girl standing right behind her. Michelle closed out the site, not knowing how long the girl had been standing there. Her cheeks suddenly flushed red as she wondered if the girl had been reading over her shoulder. "Sorry," Michelle said as she stood from her chair. The girl said coldly. "Oh, is it bitchy in here or is it just you?" The girl just rolled her eyes as she took the seat. Rob was nearing the end of the book he was flipping through when a tap on his shoulder made him jump so sharply that he almost dropped it. He instantly turned on his heels. "Ready to go?" Michelle asked, pleased with herself for giving a good scare. He was sure he had looked comical. "Oh, yeah," he said with a crack in his voice, making him sound like a prepubescent teen. They left through the automatic doors and the warm outside air came rushing at them. She told Rob, as she stood at the driver's side door with the key almost in the lock, that she needed to swing by her parents' house and pick something up. He said back to her over the roof of the car that was fine. She unlocked her door and got in, and then leaned over the passenger seat to unlock the door for him. They immediately rolled down the windows so they would not bake to death. Michelle put on her sunglasses. They were slightly horn-rimmed, like something an old lady would wear, but somehow they actually looked flattering on her. She called them her diva specs. Rob was definitely warming up to her. As she was driving, Michelle said to him without taking her eyes off the road, "I'm warning you up front, my parents are complete dicks. I hate to ask this and don't take it personally, but when we get there, would you mind waiting in the car? I'll be real quick." "No problem." A moment later, he asked, "They're really that bad?" "Oh, you have no idea. We'll be there soon. They live pretty close by." "I swear, I don't know a single person with a normal family." Michelle considered this and said, "I don't either." "Yours is whacked, mine is whacked, Sue's is whacked." "I know. I can't believe Sue hasn't even talked to her parents in 6 years." "I didn't know it had been that long." "It has. They don't want anything to do with each other. I know yours is bad from what Sue has told me." "It's not really that bad, not anymore. My mom and I are getting along really well right now. 3,000 miles of land between you and your parents can make things a lot more tolerable." "If only. I'm not moving, but you wouldn't hear me complaining if they decided to move to Texas or New York or Bolivia." "Why are yours so awful?" "It's nothing as extreme as you or Sue's situation. Mine just never understood me or accepted me. You can only take so much belittling and lecturing and yelling before you start wondering why you let these people stay in your life. You start wondering if you were even capable of loving these people who have never treated you decently for a moment. You see, their abuse was all subtle. It was slow and steady, like Chinese water torture. They drilled a hole right through my head, one drop at a time. So even though I don't really have any great horror stories to give examples of how bad they are, I can, on some level, relate to you guys." "I get that. Despite all of my stories, I do have at least some happy, almost magical memories. They do seem mostly overshadowed by all the other shit, but I can't imagine not ever having a single happy moment. I can remember playing hide-and-go-seek with my mom when I was little. I always lost because I always giggled in my hiding place. There's a bunch of stupid tiny things like that." Rob felt a smile creeping over his face. "That's nice. It's not stupid. You really never even had small moments of happiness?" "I have had some incredibly wondrous riots of fun." Rob looked at her curiously. "I just didn't have them until after I moved out, and I've never had one of those moments with them. Hell, that's what friends are for." "Yeah, friends always seem to be what family should have been." "Friends are your real family," she said. "Hallmark would be lucky to have you," he joked. "I know. I'm even making myself tear up," she said with a fake quiver in her voice. They both laughed. When they got there, Michelle pulled the car over and parked in the shade of a tree. It was a quiet little street with very few other cars on it. "I'll be right back," she told him. "I'll be right here." He watched her take a deep breath and quickly exhale it. She jogged across the street, but then returned to a walk when she got to the bottom of her parents' driveway. When she made it to their screened-in porch, she opened the rusty door and made her way to the main wooden entrance door inside. She knocked with her knuckles very loosely, making contact. It was a few seconds before it opened, halfway. Rob could see that it was a woman in the doorway. It was dark in the house, so she was heavily silhouetted. "Mommy dearest," Rob murmured. He saw Michelle's posture sulk, and then the house swallowed her up, with the gulp of the door closing. He just sat there, seeing the residence framed by the car window. It was a modest little house. It was getting to be late in the day, and the sun was casting an orange glow on the whole street. He spotted her Marlboro lights on the dashboard, for when she occasionally smoked, and he grabbed the pack. He pushed in the car's lighter and waited for it to pop back out like a done turkey. In the meantime, he was noticing how pretty the tree-lined street was. He listened to the birds twittering frantically. He heard a dog barking from Michelle's backyard. He heard little kids playing off in the distance. Their laughter was echoing through the neighborhood. All seemed serene, but Rob knew of the quiet little hell that could muster behind prettily framed suburban closed doors. He heard the click of the lighter. It was ready for use. He reached down and plucked it out and burned the cigarette until he puffed it enough to stay lit. "I just need to grab something. I'll be real quick," Michelle said. "Of course you will. God forbid you spend any time with your family," her mother replied dryly. "I know, I'm just so busy with school and work. I have no time to even—" Michelle was no longer the carefree spirit Rob had met. "Bill, your daughter's here," her mother interrupted and called down the hall. He came in the room, wiping his hands with a paper towel. He nodded at Michelle. His eye contact lasted only a second before he looked down at the floor. He turned his head away and his body followed soon after it. Then he disappeared back down the hall to continue with whatever he was doing. He had gone a little balder since she last saw him. She had just nodded back, also uncomfortable with the eye contact. Then she began to search for what she had come for. Her mother observed the interaction between her husband and her daughter with a smirk on her face. She just stood there with her arms crossed in her red and purple vertically striped dress with oversized shoulder pads. The sides of her hair were pulled together and met in the back with a metal barrette. She was wearing dark hose and pumps and just a little too much makeup. It was the wrong shade of blue over her eyes. She looked like a preppy frump, as she always did, befitting a woman of contradictions like herself. She shifted her weight very dramatically, all on her left side. When the allotted moment of awkwardness was over, she said to Michelle, "You know you can just stop pulling this little stunt. You've made your point." "What stunt is that?" Michelle smartly asked, as her hand wrapped around the handle of what she was looking for in the closet. She stood up and faced her mother, who was the same height. "You're just stopping by to rub our faces in the fact that you don't live here anymore. Well, that's all your fault. You don't have to work all the time. You need to stop hanging around that disgusting girl and come home and live a decent life." "A decent life? Under your terms? I'd rather work 168 hours a week than move back in here, and Sue is not... I have to go." Michelle moved for the door. Her mother blocked her way and said, "You can't just come by like this and talk to me like that. What about how you're talking to me? It's my house." "Right, and I don't live here anymore." She was feeling more like herself. "Now get the hell out of my way or I'm going to knock you down. You try it and I'll have your little ass in jail just like that." She snapped two fingers with press-on nails very emphatically. Michelle pushed her mother aside and walked out the door. She made her way across the lawn. "You can't do this! I'm giving all of your things to Goodwill," her mother shouted from the doorway. Michelle could hear little Lionheart barking from the backyard. She wondered if he was barking at her. She felt like everyone was against her. She stopped in the middle of the front yard and shouted back, "You can have a fucking bonfire with it for all I care. I got what I came for." She held up what she had retrieved. Then she turned back around and headed for Sue's car. All the while, her mother continued shouting until all she could come up with were obscenities. Rob watched all of it with the cigarette just hanging on his lower lip. Michelle got in the car and slammed the door. She started the engine and peeled out even louder than usual. She swerved into the lane and around the corner so fast that Rob thought the car was going to flip over. "I'm sorry," she said to him with tears streaking her cheeks. She wiped them with her shoulders while alternating her hands on the wheel. Her voice was calm despite her distraught expression. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded while sniffling. "Give me one of those." She motioned at the cigarettes. "Sure. I only need them sometimes, like now. Like right fucking now." She took one and he lit it for her. "Ugh, they're stale. They've been in here forever. It's fine, though." "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head and said, "No, it's all right. Thanks." Then she handed him the item that had been resting on her lap. "Here, toss this in the back seat, would you?" He took it and looked at it. He was computer illiterate, but he knew enough to recognize a laptop carrying case. It had a giant sticker of a daisy over the label. He turned his torso and gently placed it on top of some of the clothes that were covering most of the back seat. "Well, if you do want to talk about it, it looks like you'll finally have a story to tell," he offered. "I got 1,000,000 of those, but yet again, nothing really happened." Her lips smiled. Her eyes did not. She was understandably down for the rest of the day, and when they picked up Sue from work that night, or technically the next morning, Michelle gave her the gist of what had happened. They had a somber mood at the end of the day before they headed for bed.